And that's the end of the first half. As the teams head to the locker room, the Spartans lead the Bulldogs by a score.
You guys stink.
Geez, Coach, we're only down a couple of points.
No, I mean you guys really smell. You need to hit the showers. And here, I got every one of you new bars of soap from the Sterling Soap Company. Each bar is artisan crafted using natural ingredients and essential oils. They also have shave soaps, colognes, beard balm, and a whole lot more. Now get in there.
But Coach, we have another half to play.
I don't care. I can't stand to be around you.
A few minutes later.
All right, bring it in tight. You guys are still playing terrible, but you're smelling great out there. Now listen, you're going to need to stock up for the rest of the season. We got a lot of tough games left. So go to sterlingsoap.com after the game. That's STIRLING soap.com. You got that?
Yes, Coach.
Great. Sterlingsoap.com on 3. 1, 2, 3. Sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Misses the shot, the rebound by Bennett. Out to Blackman, quickly with 1 second to go. Blackman shot, off the rim, and LSU has won it, 59-57. Dale Brown is going to the Final Four for the second time in his reign. He lost to Indiana in 81 in the semifinals. And for the third time in the school's history, the LSU Tigers are going to the Final Four.
Sports from back in the day. From Atlanta, it's Dana on the mic, talking old school legends, bringing history to life. We go deep like a spiral in the Superdome. Back when athletes left the game due to talking alone. Jordan fadeaways, Jackie in the zone, Ollie in the ring, man, he stood all alone. From the Negro Leagues to the ABA, we break it all down, yeah, the classic way. It's Charles from the district, straight out the boot. Southern University pride, repping truth in the booth. From Baton Rouge to the nation's capital, legends on deck. Yeah, we factual, tales of the greats, gold chains and all. Baseball, who dreams in that football brawl? No clickbait, no fluff, just the facts we say. It's historically speaking, sports strong back in the game. So sit back, tune in, and hit replay. It's historically speaking sports, the classic way.
Between 1972 and 1997, the Southeastern Conference in basketball grew in stature from just being a premier football conference. During that time of growth of both prominence and popularity, the team most emblematic of that growth in national prestige was located in, of all places, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And the leader of this team from the sidelines was from, of all places, North Dakota. Hello sports fans, I'm Dana Augusta, the co-host of the Historically Speaking Sports podcast. My co-host Charles Combs will be around shortly. In this all-new episode of the podcast, Charles Combs and I will delve into the Dale Brown era at Louisiana State University. During his tenure with the Tigers, Dale Brown didn't just coach LSU basketball. He made it matter in a football-crazed state. He built a national brand. He took a program that had flashes of relevance and turned it into a powerhouse that can go toe-to-toe with anyone in the country. This was the era of superstars such as Chris Jackson, who would later become Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, whose scoring brilliance electrified the country and garnered comparisons to Pete Maravich. It was also the era of the unstoppable force of Shaquille O'Neal, a once-in-a-generation talent who turned LSU into must-see TV. And before then, there was Rudy Macklin leading the Tigers to the Final Four for the first time in nearly since the early 1950s. But the Dale Brown era wasn't just about wins and NBA draft picks. It was about personality, passion, and conviction. Brown was outspoken, emotional, and sometimes controversial. A coach who wore his heart on his sleeve and fought fiercely for his players. He believed LSU could compete with the Blue Bloods of college basketball, and for stretches from the late 1970s to the mid-1990s, it absolutely did. Later on in the show, we will send a shout out to the recently departed Dwight Bo Lamar. While Dale Brown was a significant figure for LSU, Bo Lamar put the University of Louisiana at Lafayette on the map. At the time, known as University of Southwestern Louisiana, Lamar was one of the most devastating scorers in the history of college basketball. In the early 1970s, he led the Raging Cajuns to a conference title. And not only did that, between 1971 and 1973, the Cajuns possessed the second best overall record in the country, only behind John Wooden's UCLA Bruins. We have all of this and more coming up on the Historically Speaking Sports podcast, the place where we give you the best of sports from back in the day right here on the Sports History Network.
Hey there. Welcome to Music Meets Sports, where sports legends meet custom soundtracks. Founded by music producer Ronald Tyke Oliver, Music Meets Sports was created to bridge generations, educate fans, and celebrate the greatness of both current and former athletes. We craft original songs about heroes in basketball, football, baseball, boxing, and beyond, highlighting their struggles and victories. Across all musical genres, we reintroduce fans to their favorite athletes in a way they've never heard before. From Babe Ruth to Reggie White, from rising WNBA stars to timeless NFL great stream, or download our music now on Apple Music, Amazon, and Spotify. Visit musicmeetsports.org to explore the catalog, hear new releases, and join the movement that's preserving sports history, one song at a time.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're back here on this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports podcast, the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. I'm Dana Augusta once again, joined by my right hand, my partner in sports history crime, Charles Combs. And Chuck, how you doing on this Sunday night?
I am doing very well. No longer living in an igloo. It finally warmed up. I think it's supposed to possibly snow tomorrow, but apparently, next weekend is supposed to be nearly 80, so looks like the frigid portion of winter is over, but really looking forward to tonight's topic. It gave me an opportunity to really relive a ton of my childhood, so looking forward to it.
It's both of our childhoods, and I know everybody that has clicked on to this podcast episode knows what we're talking about, and to give you a little further explanation of what we're doing. We're talking about LSU basketball. And I know that LSU basketball is not at its best right now, but once upon a time it was. And it was under the tutelage of legendary head coach Dale Brown. Between 1972 and 1997, LSU had its most successful run in the history of the program. Now, they've had some spots of success previous to his hiring in 1972. They made the Final Four in 1953, led by Bob Pettit. They had their brief encounter with Pete Maravich, but they never played in the tournament. But this was the most sustained era of success of LSU basketball ever. And we're going to get into all of the particulars about Coach Brown and what he meant to this program, and not only what he meant to the athletic program of LSU, but also to the state of Louisiana and basketball in the state of Louisiana, in which he once quipped that the hardest thing in the world to sell is the sport of basketball in Louisiana. But you know what? He did a very, very good job of doing that during his tenure in Baton Rouge. So, Chuck, before we get really rolling here, let's talk about what you remember about Coach Brown and his teams at LSU.
I remember about Coach Brown and his teams at LSU. It was a lot of things, a lot of personification of necessary things in life lessons. I think a lot of times what gravitates fans to sports is how many things can parallel to life and all of that. Because like a lot of times it was a lot of storylines. He was bigger than life. As you mentioned, he was trying to get the state of Louisiana, which is a vastly football state, interested in basketball pretty much. So he had that fight along with LSU. They were never like a big time basketball program, but throughout his tenure, it was larger than life circumstances, larger than life story arc as far as the team were concerned, larger than life on the back end, larger than life characters in
Yes.
terms of some of the players themselves and Dale Brown himself. So it was really, really, really good to go back and revisit him because it's a big part of my childhood. And Dale Brown was a big icon. If you were a kid in Baton Rouge, there's three things you liked: Dale Brown, LSU basketball, Bucksky and Bill in the Monday morning march, and Junkyard Dog, Mid-South Wrestling, Cowboy Bill Watts, and I'll add a fourth, Price LeBlanc, Toyota, baby. Just larger than life characters, man. So really looking forward to going down memory lane a bit.
Okay, I mean, the things that I remember about LSU basketball during the time was that you knew it was a big game where I lived in South Louisiana. We didn't get a lot of LSU games on television, but with me growing up where I grew up in South Louisiana, it was more like if you saw an LSU basketball game on like a Tuesday night and it wasn't on ESPN, you knew it was a big game. And 9 times out of 10, they were playing either Kentucky or Alabama or Arkansas, during those years, because those were like those like primetime games that was not being broadcast on ESPN. It was mostly ESPN in the 80s was mostly, the Big East, ACC, Big Ten. SEC was kind of an afterthought, during the early to mid 80s. And it wasn't until I think the success of LSU and Dale Brown in the 80s and going into the early part of the 1990s that LSU established a little bit of a tent peg in the national consciousness when it came to college basketball in the South. Everybody knew Kentucky. Everybody knew Alabama and Arkansas. Everybody knew those teams, but they didn't really understand all the other teams and how good they were. Florida was not a national product then. Auburn, they had Charles Barkley, but it wasn't really for a long period of time. Georgia was known for football, but they had Brees Spurs, but wasn't anywhere near long enough. So LSU basically during that time, in addition to Kentucky, put the SEC on the map as far as like a national product, And there was a couple of guys that would show up at LSU, show up in Baton Rouge along with Dale Brown in the late 80s, early 90s. They really put LSU on the map, But there was a couple of instances where LSU caught the national spotlight, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. So who were some of your favorite players from that time period? There's a lot, and you said characters, and there are a lot of characters on these teams.
Well, you got me to thinking just in what you just mentioned in terms of the overall landscape of the SEC at the time. Like the SEC outside of Kentucky didn't really have that big time blue chip basketball program. Alabama could be at times. Now, just caveat, Arkansas was in the Southwest Conference until like the early 90s. Right. When they joined the SEC. So they were in the Southwest Conference, that was the Joe Klein days and all of that. But anyway, what I liked about the SEC, unlike most conferences, specifically the Big Ten, not Big Ten, I'm sorry, the ACC and the Big East, where they had all these dominant programs. SEC, they didn't have the teams, but they had the ballers.
Yeah.
They had the ballers. Like, for example, later in Dale Brown's career, he had Chris Jackson. They had Shaq. Before that, they had, other than Akeem Olajuwon, the coldest turnaround jump I've ever seen in my life, Nikita Wilson. Well, nobody seeing his turnaround jumper. You mentioned Charles Barkley. You remember Barkley has always maintained the best player he ever played against in college was an LSU cat by the name of Leonard Swat Mitchell.
Yep,
Ballin'.
Leonard Mitchell. Yeah,
You know
we're
what I
going to
mean?
mention him in a
And
bit.
You mentioned Georgia briefly. Remember, Georgia had Dominique Wilkins.
Yeah,
Remember,
and Vern
Florida,
Fleming.
Vern Fleming. Remember, Florida had Vernon Maxwell.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Tennessee had Allen Houston. They had and then Vanderbilt. You know, they were good in basketball despite the limitations to talent due to their
high academic programs.
academic standing, and all of that. So it was a whole. Then you even go back to Ole Miss. They had Roderick Barnes. They had Gerald World Class Glass.
Yeah.
You know, just ballers. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And in Louisiana, as you mentioned, we're not really a basketball state, but so since we're not as crazy about basketball, we're passionate about it, but not nearly as passionate about football. So winning and losing doesn't matter as much as being entertained. We're more than fine with a tournament and conference contending team with a guy that can get you 50 any night. That can fill it up. We're more than welcome to watch that. But it was the SEC was really a lot of hidden gems in terms of really outstanding singular players at that time.
Exactly. I mean, you think of the landscape of the SEC at the time. I mean, you named a whole bunch of guys that were exactly what you said. They were ballers. They were guys that could, on any given night, could fill it up for 30, 35, 40 points, you know, and the SEC was known for that during that time. You know, you had Kentucky, you know, who was like the only one that was like a really legitimate, at times, a legitimate title contender. But as for like individual stars that people could actually gravitate to, a lot of them were in the SEC. And I think that during the time, the SEC kind of got a bad rap because they were still trying to have that team aspect type of thing going in college basketball. And the SEC was basically like showing what the future of college basketball was going to be in the 1980s instead of, you know, what it really became in the late 90s and 2000s. They were somewhat ahead of the game, I think.
Yes, they were definitely ahead of the game in terms of the approach. And I think the approach was they didn't lock their guys in the barn.
Right.
You know, they let their thoroughbreds run. You know, like for example, you know, you and I have always had a running joke through the years. The only guy that could ever stop Michael Jordan was Dean Smith. You know, because he just, you know, you got Big Game James, you got Mike. Why the hell are we running the four corners? For what?
Sam Perkins. What? Why you got Sam Perkins on it? Why?
Let the dogs eat. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like for example, you know what I mean? I mentioned a lot of ballers. I excluded a few because we mentioned Alabama as a program, but you remember, man, they used to have Buck Johnson, Derek McKee. Then they had Robert Horry. Then they had James Hollywood Robinson. Then they had Trail Sprewell. They always had they always had ballers too. You know what I mean? Just ballers. So the SEC was kind of ahead of the curve in a little bit. Like if you have formulating their game plans or their offensive systems to maximize the talents of their star player. You know, it was still within a team concept, but they would, you know, they knew that they would only go as far or as high as their best players could carry them. So they kind of structured the structure of the ball club as well as the schematics, especially offensively, in reflection of that.
All right. So we're talking about Dale Brown, okay, and his tenure at LSU is, if you look at it from a statistical aspect of it, is truly remarkable considering everything that he's done at that school. And it's somewhat, you know, crazy that he's not really remembered as well as a lot of people would have if he was at like another school. You know, LSU, of course, is known for football, it's known for baseball, and it's known for track. Okay. Basketball, in a way, for lack of a better term here in Louisiana, is somewhat tolerated. But you have somebody with the resume, and we're gonna go through the resume in a second. if you had the resume of a Dale Brown, if you coached somewhere else, he would be considered one of the greatest coaches of all time. In fact, Dale Brown is, in my opinion, is in my top 5 all-time greatest coaches to never win a championship. And I'm gonna go through that list in a bit, but he's up there, and he should have won a championship at LSU, at least one, with the type of teams that he had. But it's one of those things where it's like 6 in one hand and half a dozen in the other. You know what I mean? Because on one respect, you had a team to reach the Final Four that he had that had no business being there. And then you had other teams that had more than a legitimate shot of winning it all with the personnel that they had, but couldn't get out of the first round. So it was like, it's like you got the players, you got the horses, but you couldn't get there. But in another situation, you have a team that literally overachieved and got to the Final Four unexpectedly. In a number of cases, 2 times of teams that really didn't really have was somewhat of a Cinderella to make it to the Final Four. Okay, so let's run down and just a little bit, just touch on his resume. 15 straight national tournament appearances. The only SEC coach to accomplish that. 15 straight tournament appearances. Second in wins behind Adolph Rupp in the Southeastern Conference. Brown and Rupp each had 17 consecutive non-losing seasons. Brown was one of 7 coaches to lead 2 or more teams to the Final Four from the Southeastern Conference. Those other coaches, maybe you've heard of these. John Calipari, Billy Donovan, Joe B. Hall, Rick Pitino, Nolan Richardson, and Adolph Rupp. That's some pretty good company.
That's coaching. That's getting it done. That's for sure. And, I guess due to his loquacious personality and how outspoken he could be in terms of not only the NCAA, but also non-basketball things. Sometimes his actual competence gets tremendously overlooked as a result.
Yeah, and he was very critical. We can touch on this real quick. He was very critical of the NCAA for a number of different incidents and a number of different ways, for what I can remember. He used to call the NCAA stood for not caring about athletes. That was his MO, about how the NCAA treated players and stuff like that. He was pretty much an early proponent of paying players, to come to the. He was an early proponent of that. He was really on the side of athletes more than most coaches of his stature, especially during that time, that he coached in the 70s and 80s.
Yes, he certainly was. He was definitely a proponent of that because, like a lot of these players, especially being from in the deep South and then recruiting a lot of players from Louisiana and some of those southern states, they would have very, very humble beginnings. And so like a lot of times the NCAA would kind of be a bit too harsh in terms of what was quote unquote an improper benefit. So as a result, Dale was like, man, you guys make all this money, all these TV contracts. And then obviously this was the infancy of what NCAA sports as well as basketball will ultimately become from a television standpoint.
Right.
But he could see the writing on the wall that you're making all this money, but then a lot of the players that are the revenue drivers, you give them hell and all of that in terms of money outside of hoops and all of that. So he was definitely ahead of his time. He was definitely a player's coach, and he definitely had all of his players and athletes back.
Well, another thing that he was the early proponent of is recruiting outside of the United States. He was an early proponent of that, with guys like Gert Hammock, and Jose Vargas, Zoran Jovanovic. He would bring players from Europe. He had no problem going overseas to recruit players to come to LSU. And he was an early proponent of that. And again, a lot of these coaches now have no problems going overseas to try to get a player from Europe or the Dominican or or South America or somewhere to come play for their squad, knowing that he had the forethought that basketball was slowly becoming a global game. And he was an early proponent of trying to take advantage of that during his tenure at LSU.
Yes. Also, Tito Horford,
Yep.
Roman Marchenko.
Yep.
Cats like that. And then he was also a proponent against the Prop 48 rule at the time. Because at the time, Proposition 48, where I guess if a student wasn't able to get even if they passed ACC, if they the ACT, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But you didn't get a certain score or, a metric, depending on a certain score, your grade point average coming out of high school, you were ineligible as a freshman automatically a lot of times. No, regardless of, what they did academically as a freshman in school, they were ineligible because the spirit of the rule was, okay, he obviously needs to get his feet under him because he's a quote unquote student athlete, get his feet under him as far as being a student is concerned. Then we can add the athlete part onto it. But a lot of times he was against that a lot of times as well, because they would have to sit out an entire season and all of that. So he was really ahead of the curve, and he really was staunchly against the NCAA on a variety of fronts.
Now, to continue his resume, 2-time National Coach of the Year. He beat Kentucky 18 more times, more than any other coach ever in any conference. And another stat, but I think is one of the most important stats, 115 of 160 players that he coached received their college degree. Between 1979 and 1993, LSU had reached the postseason tournament, either the NCAA or the NIT, a total of 15 seasons, 13 of 15 tournament with NCAA tournament berths. 2 Final Fours, 1981 and 1986, 4 SEC regular season titles, 1979, 1981, 1985, and 1991. 1980 SEC tournament champ, which is the only time LSU men's basketball team had ever won the SEC tournament. 1981 Sporting News College Basketball Coach of the Year, and 4-time SEC Coach of the Year. So that's a pretty good resume for a guy that coached a basketball team at a college that's best known for football.
Getting it done. And the most important stat that you mentioned was getting those degrees, getting those diplomas from a lot of those guys, because they've had a lot of great players throughout the years, but despite that, making the NBA is a long shot. So to be able to not only help cultivate the players on the court, but help cultivate them off the court, first of all, to help them see the importance and the necessity of a college education and degree, but then also, cultivate and mentor them and help them take the steps towards accomplishing that feat. Just a great coach, great legendary coach. And as you mentioned earlier, like how sometimes he would have an abundance of talent and couldn't get it done, but then he could get it done with less talent. I think he was besieged, unfortunately, with a couple of extremes where he was so used to working with the cupboard is barren, so he had to get very, very creative to kind of help overcome some of those deficiencies, whereas some of those more talented teams, it was a bit more difficult to do, not only from the standpoint of navigating the personalities, but also getting people to accept the proper roles in order for team success. Because when nobody is no good, it's easy. I'm not going to say no good, but they're less talented, and they're not really talented enough to be there. It's easy to get people to accept those roles for the greater good. But then when you get these talented players, I think it was a tale of extremes. Like if you could have had some of the talent, the tangibles with the talent, but some of those intangibles from those less talented teams, then he really would have been cooking, but, great coach.
Like I said, he took over in 1972. Now, who would have thought that someone with a legendary career at Louisiana State University would come from North Dakota, of all places? He's from a little small town called Minot, North Dakota. And this was his first college head coaching job. He had been a high school head coach. He was a college assistant coach for a number of years before taking over at LSU in 1972. And let's give you a little bit of a landscape of LSU athletics in 1972, which I found interesting. LSU football, led by the legendary, what we used to call Charles McClendon. He was in his 11th season at LSU. His quarterback was a man named Burt Jones. Now, he was going into his senior year in 1973. Burt Jones was still the quarterback at LSU in 1972. LSU that year went 9-2-1 on the season, 4-1-1 which was good enough for third place in the SEC. Interestingly enough, LSU, Georgia, and Ole Miss that year became the last teams in the United States to integrate. LSU, Ole Miss, and Georgia were that year integrated, allowed black players to play on their teams for the first time in 1972, which is crazy to me. But that year they lost to Tennessee in get this, remember the Astro Blue Bonnet Bowl?
I remember it.
They lost to Tennessee 24-17 in that game. Meanwhile, LSU baseball finished second in the SEC, Western Division, to Ole Miss, who defeated Vanderbilt to win the SEC in the SEC tournament to go to Omaha. They had a record. LSU that year had a record of 21-21 overall, 7-11 in the SEC. Dale Brown would replace head coach Press Maravich, and who, of course, is the father of Pete Maravich. The year before, the Tigers went 14 that year. Let's see. I don't have it down, but they had a losing season under Press Maravich this last season in 1971. So they had to bring in a new coach. Press Maravich decided to go on. His son had already left for the pros. So Dale Brown gets the head coaching job in 1972. And the Tigers in his first season had a winning record, 14-10, had a 500 record in the SEC, 99, and finished fifth in the Southeastern Conference. And of course, you had Kentucky with Joe B. Hall, who had just taken over for Adolph Rupp, and LSU would continue to battle their way through the mid-70s. By the late 70s, I have written down, they went 15-12, and then in 78, they went 18-9. Okay, setting the stage for the breakout year for Dale Brown and LSU, which was in 1979.
Yes, sir. And just kind of to fill in a couple of gaps in terms of the ineptitude of LSU basketball prior to his arrival. When he arrived in 1972, they had only had 2 winning seasons and no NCAA tournament appearances and only 1 NIT appearance in 6 years. They hadn't been to the NCAA tournament, and they had only had 4 winning seasons since 1954. So they just were total ineptitude. And then, to fill in the gap on Press Maravich, he had gone, obviously, it was because who his son was. It had nothing to do with him. They went 10-16 in his final season. So yes, he kind of at the same time, as you mentioned, started out 14-10 the first year, 9-9. But that first year they finished fifth despite being picked to finish last in the SEC. And then he started the inroads because everybody thought he was crazy because he immediately started running all over the state trying to sell basketball in a football-rich state, not only to gain fandom, but also lay down the foundation for recruiting purposes and all of that. So then eventually, to your point, it leads us to 1979 and the breakthrough that they finally broke through after steadily going up the mountain. Fill us in.
1979, LSU goes 23-6 that year, 14-4 in the SEC. They win their first regular season championship. First team SEC performance from LSU. These guys, Dwayne Scales and Al Green. Dwayne Scales, 19 points, 12 rebounds per game that year, and Al Green with 17 points per game that year. First tournament appearance for the Tigers since 1954. But they reached the Sweet 16 that year, something that will seem insurmountable. But here's the thing, and here's the start of a recurring theme. They lose to the Sweet 16 to Magic Johnson and Michigan State, 87-71. Okay. But one of the key players that they lose early in the season that will become a major factor down the road for them is a forward by the name of Rudy Macklin. He got lost in the second game of the season and was lost for the year. But they end up losing to Michigan State, the eventual national champion, which will become a recurring theme for LSU throughout not only 1979, but throughout most of the 1980s, losing to the eventual national champion.
Yes, they made a lot of strides led by Dwayne Scales and Al Green, finished 14-4 in SEC, won regular season title, and as you mentioned before, made the Sweet 16 before losing to Magic Johnson and Judd Heathcote and all of those guys.
Greg Kelser, that team.
But key component that we have to take into account, Dwayne Scales was suspended for the entire tournament due to violating team rules. Now, once again, that speaks to Dale Brown in terms of his emphasis on building young men as opposed to basketball players. Because and I know, and probably me too, I'm not sitting one of my ballers for the tournament. I don't care what he did, but he saw the bigger pictures. He's trying to develop great young men as opposed to simply basketball players. So even if it may cost them result-wise and even him professionally, cultivating him as a young man was more important. So you sit out for the tournament. We don't care what the consequence is on the court as a result of that.
Do you think that at times Dale Brown was a little bit too much of a disciplinarian? I know he's known as the master motivator. I know that he had like certain concrete rules that made him such of an old school coach. But do you think that some of the decisions that he made, especially later in his career, dealing with that style that he had of being like overly disciplined, could have cost him later on down in the years, or have cost him in certain situations?
It probably did. It probably did. But sometimes, it's about the big picture sometimes.
Yeah.
You're trying to develop, you try to find anything, and I'm sure you're the same way. Yeah. I try to be the same way. You try to find things in people better than you left them.
Yeah.
Regardless. And sometimes I did it cost him some success? Obviously. But I wouldn't say that he was too disciplined, because all you got to do is look at what's going on now.
Right.
Just in the world in general. Just now. How there's a lack of discipline and people are just totally out of control.
Right.
And so I don't think that he was too disciplined, because, you just can't, sometimes you have to kind of nip things in the bud, and you're trying to develop these young men as people, now you're trying to win some basketball games too, but we've covered several stories throughout my appearances on the show in terms of people with no discipline. You remember? We talked about Lawrence Phillips.
Yeah.
People like that.
Right.
So I don't think. And then besides that, we don't know the specifics of the offenses or grievances. We don't know. They just simply say that he violated team rules. We don't know specifically what that entails. So I would give him the benefit of the doubt in that regard.
Okay, so they make the tournament for the first time in 1979 under Dale Brown. Okay, so things are starting to really look up in Baton Rouge after a few years of building up. 1980, they had the same carbon copy record in the SEC of 14-4 in the SEC, but also they improved by 3 games, going 26-6. Rudy Macklin returns, plays the entire season. Macklin and Scales turn out to be the best forward combination in the country. Macklin was named first team All SEC, 18 points per game. Scales second team All SEC at 16 points per game. Both finished second in the SEC. They won the SEC tournament for the first and only time in LSU's basketball history. They reached the regional final and again lost to the eventual champion Louisville with Denny Crum and Darrell Griffith and Lancaster Gordon in that group. Ethan Martin was also at guard, who's really started to perform toward the end of that year, was named second team All SEC. That would set the stage for the next year. But let's talk about this team here, 1980, 26-6, 14-4 in the Southeastern Conference. And they win the conference tournament for the only time in their history.
Hooping. Getting it done. Hooping, man. Because one of my favorite players, I know about Rudy Macklin. I know him predominantly post LSU basketball career because like a lot of times I guess due to his presence, and once again at the outset I mentioned like a lot of these guys were larger than life and they were quite impressionable, especially on us. We were kids at the time. He used to be on the variety of commercials selling different things and all of that. But Ethan Martin, man, he was a hooper. He was a serious hooper. They were a very good team, but Denny Crum, Dr. Duncanstein, Darrell Griffith. Yeah, that's a very difficult combination to overcome, and they just couldn't overcome that. And even though very good team, just not good enough, and that marked their 3rd year in a row losing to the eventual champion, which has to be frustrating because if you can compete with them, you're right there, but then you just that little extra that you need to kind of get over the hump. They just were not able to summon that.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, either my first season or second season of the podcast, I did a whole episode of the 1980 Final Four. Which was Louisville winning their first ever national championship. With Denny Crum and Darrell Griffith and stuff. Winning it in Indianapolis. But yeah, LSU again. Now, will they be able to make that next step? They made it to the Sweet 16 in 1979. They make it to the regional final in 1980, one step away from the Final Four. Will they make that next step in 1981? And the answer to that question is yes. 1981, which is the winningest year in LSU basketball history. 31-5, 17-1 in the SEC. They missed the perfect season by losing to Kentucky at Rupp Arena late in the season. They won the regular season championship in the SEC, obviously, reached the Final Four only for the second time in history. The only other time, 1953. First Final Four in the Dale Brown era. And the only loss, like I mentioned, in conference was Kentucky at Rupp Arena. The accolades were far and plenty for LSU in 1981. Rudy Macklin, second team All-American, first team All-SEC. Ethan Martin, the baller that you just said, 12 points per game, first team All-SEC. Howard Carter, Howard Carter, 16 points, second team All-SEC. That guy was amazing. That guy was a straight baller. Howard Martin for LSU. And, of course, Leonard Mitchell, the one you talked about, 11 points per game in 1981. This team was loaded with players, loaded with ballers.
Man, High C used to be balling, man. Like you mentioned, they 17-1, but just a little further deep dive on that, they won 26 straight games, including the first 17 SEC games. So that loss in in Rupp Arena, they were looking to run the table for the season.
Yeah.
But that was when I think Kentucky. I know they were Joe B. Hall.
Joe B. Hall was the coach.
And
that's
that's
right.
when they had I think Kyle Macy.
Yeah.
You know,
Kyle Macy was Sam Bowie on that team too?
81, probably so, because he got out of there at 84. So he probably was, you know.
Yeah, he probably was.
I remember Kyle Macy because I remember
Kyle Macy for sure was on that team. Kyle Macy, yeah.
The battles he and Ethan Martin used to have, man, those used to be some major league battles. And then, you know, Kyle Macy, he went on to have a very, very solid career running the point for the Phoenix Suns throughout the 80s and all of that. So they did that. And as you mentioned, the individual accomplishment as well as that. And then they had a little home cooking because they went through the tournament and then got to the regional. And it's no better thing than having the Elite Eight in your backyard, basically, in the Louisiana Superdome, and they beat Wichita State, the Shockers. They beat them,
and they lived up to their name in that tournament because they upset a couple people just to get to the regional final that year. I mean, I don't know if people remember this, but LSU had a first round bye in that was back when teams got byes in the NCAA tournament. They had a first round bye. Second round, LSU beat Lamar, coached by the great Billy Tubbs, who would later lead Oklahoma to the Final Four, beat them 100-78. And in the regional semifinal, LSU beat Arkansas 72-56, you know, to set up the regional final in the Superdome against the Wichita State Shockers, who up until a couple of years ago, the only thing I knew about Wichita State was their baseball team, because you know I'm a big college baseball guy.
Yes, sir.
And I think of Wichita State, I think of Gene Stevenson, the legendary coach over there. But they had a really decent basketball team there. They ended up LSU beating Wichita State 96-85 in the Superdome. And they advanced to the Final Four for the first time since 1953 in Philly.
Question for you before you get rolling, right?
Uh-huh.
That game that they beat Arkansas.
Right.
Was Sidney Moncrief in town at the time?
I think he was. I really think Sidney Moncrief was on that team because didn't Arkansas doing that? I think either that tournament or the year before. It was like him, either he hit a shot from a midcourt shot against Texas, I want to say.
Yes. Now, look at these ballers they also had, man. Darrell Walker.
Yep.
Scott Hastings.
Yes.
Now, Scott, he was just known for laying wood in the pros.
Right.
But he could put it in the hole in college, man. So these were the days when they were good, man. These players, and then you remember they had an old player, one of my favorite players, who was an assistant coach for umpteenth years under Dale Brown, the old bullet Johnny Jones.
Johnny Jones, yep.
The no bullet, boy. They because he come in there, he pushed that ball, man. Yep. No bullet, Johnny Jones, man. These were some major league ballers, and you said that they reached the Final Four, but unfortunately, a casualty as a result of winning that game. Yep. Macklin got dinged up in that win, so they went to into the Final Four. Perhaps a little bit lower, not quite 100%.
That's right. I mean, I was just about to get to that. Rudy Macklin gets hurt, gets a little bit dinged up. He does play in the national semifinal against Indiana. He does play, but he's not at 100%, and it is evident. LSU gets off to a really good start in this game against Indiana. However, in the second half, Indiana outscores LSU 40-19. They go an 8-minute stretch from the end of the first half and like the first 7 minutes of the second half without scoring a point. And they just could not get the ball in the basket. It wasn't like the Hoosiers were playing just great defense. LSU just took a lot of bad shots. I went back in preparation for this game. I went back and watched that game. And LSU just took a lot of bad shots, took a lot of rush shots. They just got so impatient offensively. It ended up losing 67-49. But believe it or not, they weren't done. They still had one more game to play because this was the last year of the consolation game for third place.
Oh, man.
And their opponents in that game, Ralph Sampson and Virginia.
Okay, that's quite interesting.
They would lose to Virginia in the third place game, which would be the last time the NCAA would have a third place game. So they discontinued it. But here's a little question for you. Did you know the championship game was nearly canceled? Do you know why?
Reagan got shot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
President Reagan got shot the afternoon before the finals.
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about canceling it, because a lot of people weren't going to pay. But Reagan was like, no, the game needs to be played. Go ahead and play the game. Get your mind off of this, And so they ended up playing. Isaiah Thomas had a great game. Final Four MVP. Indiana wins the second national championship in 5 years. Bobby Knight wins another championship. But LSU, once again, got ousted out of the tournament by the eventual national champion.
Okay. They were really close. Just two questions for you, because you said you went back and revisited. First, had Rudy Macklin been 100%, because this was a little bit before my time, but I remember High C Howard Carter, because my brother used to love him and all that. I remember him. Had he been 100%, would that had a material effect on the result?
I don't think it would have been. It would have been, because Rudy Macklin did gut it out, but a lot of it was just bad execution by LSU.
So he didn't pull a LaDainian Tomlinson on you.
No,
I'm trying to get at you for what you did to me last time.
That I agree with you on. But no, it wasn't. No, I think it was just a lot of bad execution. Indiana made a run toward the end of the first half. LSU tried to counter that and kind of got out of their game. It fed right into what Indiana was trying to do, trying to speed up the game, was trying to speed them up offensively, which seems counterintuitive because of the way LSU played. But it tried to speed them up offensively and get them out of their own rhythm, and they just hoisted up like really bad shots, as well as just, had an awful shooting night. They picked the worst possible time to have their worst shooting night of the year.
Always the worst time, man. And second question, and then a clarifying question. Well, I asked the second question first, then the clarifying question.
Okay.
In terms of third place games, consolation games, you've known me for 29 years. Because we became friends in 1997. So you know me well enough to know how I would feel about a third place game.
You wouldn't play.
Of course not.
You wouldn't play.
What about you?
Would I play? Yeah. If this was my last game playing in college, I probably would play.
For third place.
Why not?
I guess.
That's just me. Why not? I know it's for nothing. And I know, but if I was a junior, knowing I was coming back the next year, I probably wouldn't. Because I wouldn't. But if this was my last game, my last collegiate game, I would play.
That makes sense. Honestly, when you explain it that way, it makes sense.
If I had a chance to go pro, I would be hesitant of playing. I would still want to play, but I would be hesitant. If I knew I wasn't going pro and this was my last game, I would play.
You mean, now by pro, you mean NBA frontiers or overseas?
NBA.
Okay.
If I was playing, I would be more hesitant if I was playing in the NBA. If I was going overseas to play, I would still play.
Okay. Got you.
NBA, I would be a little bit more hesitant, especially during that time.
Now, okay, got it. Now on to my clarifying question, because we spoke about 1980 a minute ago, and if I recall correctly, was it 1980 when Denny Crum and Darrell Griffin won the title?
Yes.
That was John Wooden's last team with Kiki Vandeweghe, right?
No. Wooden had retired in 75. That was Larry Brown. Larry Brown was the coach of UCLA.
I know I got the Kiki Vandeweghe part.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Kiki Vandeweghe was on UCLA in 1980.
Baller, by the way.
Yes.
Baller.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that was the Kiki Vandeweghe team coached by Larry Brown.
Okay, got it. Thanks for clarifying.
Okay. We're going to skip ahead here. Go a little bit quickly. 82 through 1985. Howard Carter and Leonard Mitchell still there, but they missed the tournament, the NCAA tournament in 82 and 83. 82, they go 14-14. In 83, they go 19-13. Both seasons, they reached the NIT, but they both lose in the first round. But in 1984, they add a few guys that would become the backbone of the teams that we would come to know and love in South Louisiana for the next number of years. First guy, one of your personal favorites, Iceman Reynolds.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Iceman Reynolds. You also got Derek Taylor, Nikita Wilson, Don Redden, and John Williams. Not the composer. John Williams, the baller from L.A. And this will become the backbone of the next few years for LSU that will see one of their most beloved teams to ever grace the campus of South Baton Rouge. 1984, they go 18-11. They get back to the tournament, but they lose in the first round. They upset by all teams Dayton, who's a number 10 seed. Okay, 1985, they improve by a game. They go 19-10. They lose to a young David Robinson and Navy, who's a 13 seed. They lose to them. They actually get blown out, 78-55 in Dayton. So from 1982 through 1985, there's not really much to speak of. But you could tell that they're making strides to make a return trip not only to the Final Four, but to become back into national prominence, especially at a time in 1985 when college basketball is really becoming big business and big box office in America.
Yes, sir. And these were some good years, and like you mentioned, some ballers. Because I remember all of the battles. You remember, because as you mentioned before, old caveat before, SEC LSU basketball didn't get a lot of national coverage, but that's okay. Because you remember old Jefferson Pilot Sports.
Yes, sir.
With I forget the play-by-play man. But
was it Tim Brando?
Tim Brando was the play-by-play man, and the color time commentator was
Larry
Joe
Connolly.
Dean. No, it was Joe Dean first.
It was Joe Dean. That's right. It was Joe Dean.
When they shoot that ball, Nikita Wilson hit that turnaround. Old Joe Dean say who would eventually become LSU's athletic director. He say, Nikita Wilson playing a little string music right now.
So that brings back memories. Oh my God, that brings back memories.
Iceman, Derek Taylor, man, good player, but was money from the top of the key.
Yes.
I already talked about Nikita Wilson in that cold turnaround. And then my main man, the late, great, I cried when he died, Don Redden, man.
Yeah.
Baller. He give you everything you got, and then bringing up the real. You got to say his name right. John, he wasn't known as Hot Plate yet, but John Hot Plate Williams,
I mean, you tell me when you said Tim Brando and Joe Dean doing the LSU games on television. Oh man, for Jefferson Pilot Sports. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Jefferson Pilot Sports was the ESPN of the South. They would do the SEC football games. They would do the SEC basketball games. I mean, I tell you, it was some of the best times. Was there? Don't necessarily remember. Was Golden Flake potato chips one of their lead sponsors?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
So it's still, to me, the best potato chips on planet Earth.
Do they still have Golden Flake? Because I know.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. They sell them here in the South. I mean, I know you're up there in Maryland. They probably don't go that far, but here in Georgia, they're all over the place. Especially I love the Sweet Heat barbecue potato chips from Golden Flake. Oh, the Sweet Heat barbecue. Oh, it's so good.
Man, I used to love to get the nachos, and then you open the bag. I get a whole bottle of hot sauce, dump the hot sauce in there, then grab the bag and shake it up.
Oh, first. Yeah, that's how you do that. That's right.
Then you eat it, and then just another caveat that has nothing to do with this, people. Man, not only don't they have Golden Flake up here, man, these clowns don't even have Bluebell ice cream up here, man.
Oh, what a shame. What a shame.
I gotta order it half the time, man, if I want it, unless I go back home. But
Bluebell ice cream. Oh my God, cookies and cream.
People look at me like I'm crazy. I'm like, bro, they're like, Borden is the best. I'm like, man, they're not seeing Bluebell. But nonetheless, man, on to the Tigers, man. The foundation was set. Foundation was set for the impending upswing. Take us away, brother.
1986, perhaps the most memorable season in program history, but it didn't start off well for the Tigers at all. Iceman Reynolds decided to go pro heading into that year. Tito Harford, the aforementioned Tito Harford, the father of NBA star Al Harford, was kicked off the team. Zoran Jovanovic injured his knee, the center. Nikita Wilson was academically ineligible. And to top things off, the LSU Tigers was infected with a chickenpox epidemic, which sidelined a number of people during the stretch run of the season. They started off 14-0, despite all of that. But when the chickenpox hit, they finished a paltry 22-11. So they still had enough juice to make it into the tournament because, for the most part, they reached the semifinals of the SEC tournament, ended up losing to Kentucky by 3. Okay, so despite all of that, they finished in the semifinals of the SEC tournament. Okay, so they were granted an 11th seed, and a lot of people during that time were upset that LSU was given a berth despite of everything that happened and despite of them struggling during the late part of the season. LSU that year would have been considered what you would call, in today's parlance, a bubble team. And they were pretty much one of those last team in, first team out type of things. And it was akin to, and to compare it, I know it's cross sports, but it's a lot like what happened to LSU in 1986 is parallel to what happened to the University of Miami's football team in the college playoffs this year. They got in, and a lot of people got upset because they got in. But once they got in, they took full advantage of it and pretty much ran the table all the way, in LSU's case, ran it all the way to the Final Four, which no one expected. Especially the fact of the loaded bracket that they were in. Because let me tell you something, the bracket that they were in was some real heavyweights in that bracket. So the committee let them in, but they weren't doing them any favors.
Correct. They stacked the deck against them, man, and and like you mentioned, out of all the LSU basketball teams, this is by far my favorite team, man. Because
yes. For a lot of people it is. Because
as I mentioned before, it was a lot of things, like a lot of life parallels that this team had. Overcoming adversity. Taking the most of an opportunity, not worrying about what naysayers having to say, proving your things on the sound like things that you can apply to life, right?
Right.
So and then just a lot, and then as I mentioned before, like the extremities, it's hard to get people to accept certain roles when the talent level is at a certain level. But when it's not, it's more easier, as evidenced by one of my favorite all-time Tigers, shooting guard Ricky Blanton.
Yes.
When they had all of the injuries and they didn't have a center because Horford was kicked off. Jovanovic was blew his knee out. Nikita Wilson wasn't there. He had to move the center at a paltry 6'7", but didn't complain and, made the most of it.
See, I was about to bring up Ricky Blanton as one of the two factors that led to their run in the tournament. Ricky Blanton, who became the heart of that team, the emotional heart of that team, who was there, and also the implementation of one of the best known tactics devised by Dale Brown, the infamous freak defense. Now, in the parlance of today, it would probably go with a more politically correct name as maybe a hybrid defense. But it was a freak defense. So basically what it was, now correct me if I'm wrong, Chuck, the freak defense is essentially has characteristics of both man-to-man and zone, right?
Yes.
The zone, basically you have the two types of zone LSU ran at the time was a box and one or a triangle and two.
That's it.
And they kind of meshed together. It had some components of man-to-man, but some components of zone. And it was hard for a point guard to come up the floor. It was hard to decipher what defense that they're in. And it kind of disrupted the team's offensive flow because it was essentially what it was. It was a freak defense. It wasn't like a junk defense, but it was very effective in slowing the game down and causing disruptions on the opposing offensive flow.
Yes, and I also think that the freak defense sort of took a life of its own. It freaked out opponents.
Yeah.
Like, how sometimes people will show you a wrinkle, like in boxing a lot of times, people like Floyd Mayweather with his shoulder roll. That's a component of his defense. He doesn't exclusively do that, but sometimes people can make something more than it is. And I think in a lot of these games, they would just, because, it's all in the media, the freak defense, the opponents, especially with the short turnarounds of the tournament, they would just become so preoccupied with that because you remember the freak also, sometimes he'll go straight man-to-man out of it. Sometimes he'll play like a little soft matchup zone out of it, especially if the team wasn't particularly a strong outside shooting team. So I think a lot of times teams, because those were the 45-second shot clock days, they would waste the first 25 seconds trying to diagnose what they're doing instead of running their stuff. And then next thing you know, you're in a rush to get a shot. You're taking bad shots. And to your point, since you're waiting so late in the clock to get started, you're slowing the game all the way down, which aids LSU from that standpoint, because due to all of the injuries and the lack of talent, their rotation was maybe 7 at the time. They were not playing a lot of guys. So that was helping them keep them fresh and all of that. So, but it was a great run. And then you could take away here, but it was also another controversial thing because even though they were the 11th seed going into the tournament, the first 2 rounds, the site was at the Assembly Center on LSU's campus. So basically they had home games for the first 2 rounds. And that pissed everybody out. I don't think that's ever happened since.
In fact, I was just about to say that the next year they disallowed it. The very next year, the NCAA passed the rule saying that teams cannot play tournament games on their home floor. Now, we're going to get into a situation later, which LSU had to deal with the reverse of that. But that year, LSU, their first 2 games of the tournament was in Baton Rouge at the Assembly Center, and which was crazy. And plus, to your point about the freak defense, this was the time period in college basketball where coaches had different sort of gimmicky type defenses and offenses, because you remember Temple had the famous matchup zone.
Yes, sir.
You know, UNLV had the amoeba defense.
Yes.
Pete Carrill at Princeton had the Princeton offense, which was very prevalent and nearly took down Georgetown in the late 80s. So each one of these coaches has a little bit of a gimmick with them. You really don't see that anymore. Nolan Richardson later on with
40 minutes of hell.
Yes, 40 minutes of hell,
Yes, sir.
with the pressure defense. I mean, you don't see that anymore. At this time period, coaches was more bigger than life than what they are now. You know, certain coaches was basically the personifications of their programs, in college basketball. This is the golden age of basketball when it came down to that. And you really don't see that anymore.
It was just tremendous. And it was just a variety of factors, I think. Because I think the coaches were larger than life to a degree, but I think also we were kids, so we were at our most impressionable.
True.
Then, it was the 80s where pretty much the expansion of cable, movies, hip hop, rock and especially pop and rock and roll, and the beginning of the music video, anything went, man. Because I still remember the song. What is it? The group. You are an obsession. You're my obsession.
Yes,
What do you want me to
That's
be?
it. Yeah.
That song would never get played on the radio now. Or
No.
If you want to ride, don't ride the right horse. You remember on the radio, if you want to be rich, then you got to be and basketball was the same. It was every year, it seemed like due to TV, they were breaking new frontier. They were making new stars. You remember the Big East became stars. Then, then you start seeing Bobby Knight and Gene Katie. They both were just hella animated. And then these gimmicks with the LSU freak defense and Dale Brown with his charisma. So the tournament was really becoming what we eventually became known as the tournament. Even though they always had a tournament, this was the beginning of
This was the beginning of truly March Madness, right?
Yes, this was the beginning. Before it was just the NCAA tournament. This is when the inception kind of March Madness at this time.
Right. And LSU that year, 1986, made March mad because first round at the Assembly Center, they beat Purdue 94-87 in double overtime. Okay.
Yes.
Round two, and perhaps the greatest shot in the history of the Assembly Center.
My favorite LSU game.
Against number 3 seed Memphis State. Anthony Wilson hits a shot at the buzzer to survive Memphis State 83-81. A little 10-foot jump shot off of an offensive rebound put back gives the Tigers a win and to advance to the Sweet 16, where they would have to travel to Atlanta to face, of all teams, Bobby Cremins and Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Now, remember I said that LSU would have to face something in reverse. They would, because they would have to face Georgia Tech in their home city of Atlanta, not at Alexander Memorial Coliseum, but the game would be in the Omni, which, if you know Atlanta and where I live, is literally a 10-minute walk from Alexander Coliseum to where the Omni was, because it's been torn down by now to make room for Phillips Arena. But it's literally a 10-minute walk from Alexander Coliseum to the Omni. So it's essentially not necessarily playing on Georgia Tech's home floor, but it's damn close. And there's a lot of Atlantans that was at that game.
Correct. And I mean, it was the house that Dominique Rick Flan, the American Dream, Dusty Rose built. That's the house that they built. But then going back to Memphis State game, one of my favorite games, because you remember they had Andre Turner and they had Big William Belford. They had made the Final Four with the 3 Big East teams in St. John's, Villanova, and Georgetown the year before.
Right.
But then, so they thought they were 3 seed. They thought that they would beat them easily, but it was the game was tied. They shot the ball. LSU took a shot, missed it, William Bedford, I don't know what the hell he was doing. He had the ball in his hand. Somehow he lost it, and it was a mad scramble for the ball and on the floor. And Anthony Wilson picked it up and just shot it from like 10 feet and banked it in at the gun. And you remember the Memphis State coach was so pissed because they're already mad because they're basically playing a road game. He barely tapped Bill Brown's hand, didn't bother to shake it. But guess what? Keep walking while you're talking, brother. You're out of the tournament. We're going to Atlanta. Keep walking while you're talking, man. So yeah, then that sets the stage for what? The Sweet 16 battle against, as you mentioned, Georgia Tech. They 2-seeded. How you like these names? Mark Price, John Sally, Tom Hammonds, Bruce Dalrymple.
Yep.
How you like those? Coached by Bobby Crimmins. You would like your chances, but take it away, brother.
I mean, again, I sat back and watched this game in preparation for this. In the beginning of the game, Bobby Crimmins was always known as a run and gun type of coach. He was always known for that, right? LSU, with the freak defense, slowed the game down and kept the game close, okay? And Mark Price did the best that he could do. He was the beginning of what Georgia Tech became Point Guard University. He was the start of that.
Yes,
okay. Sir. But unfortunately, at the beginning, they couldn't stop John Sally down low. They couldn't. But for some reason, Bobby Crimmins went away from it, okay, which gave LSU its opening. Okay, and then from that point on, LSU kept knocking it away, got the lead, and it ended up winning 70-64, beating a number 2 seed. So if you're keeping score at home, they beat number 3 Memphis State. They beat number 2 seed Georgia Tech, literally in their backyard. And so now the Sunday afternoon regional championship game in Atlanta against Kenny Skywalker and Kentucky for the right to advance to Dallas in the Final Four.
Yes, sir. Just balling, man. And it was a great game, set the stage for that battle. But that Georgia Tech game was great. But I just wanted to give some kudos, man. LSU only had 70 points, right, in that ball game. 50 of them came from Derek Taylor and the late great Don Redden, man.
Yep.
And then you get Anthony Wilson with the timely shooting on the boards. And then you look at Ricky Blanton, 34 minutes, 2 out of 3, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 2 steals, 4 points. But man, he was just in there, kind of playing basketball like football in terms of just imposing his will. Because you remember you talked about the fast Sally start, and then it just keeping possessions alive, not necessarily getting the rebound, but keeping the ball alive to get the possession. They basically outwilled them, and they took it from them. They took it from them fair and square.
So they advanced to the regional finals that Sunday afternoon. They played top-seeded Kentucky. They've already beaten the number 3 seed. They've already beaten the number 2 seed. Now they're facing the number 1 seed, Kentucky. Kenny Skywalker, coached by Eddie Sutton. Again, like I said, one of the greatest coaches in the history of college basketball to never win a national championship. The others I consider great like that, of course, Dale Brown. But Eddie Sutton, Ray Meyer, Lefty Drizel, Guy Lewis, and Lou Cornacecca. All them coaches at least should have had at least one championship. But for situations beyond their control, and sometimes were their control, they just couldn't get it done. Anyway, second Final Four that LSU had reached under head coach Dale Brown. They were the first 11th seed to reach the Final Four. And they did this, by beating Kentucky by 2 points, okay? And it was a defensive slugfest, okay, for them. That whole game was a defensive slugfest, but LSU got it done. Key shots down the stretch by Nikita Wilson, and shut down Kenny Walker, which was one of the top college players of the year that year. So LSU makes it again to the Final Four by a slim 2-point win, but most of it was basically their defense holding down Kenny Walker.
Yes, and they just I vividly recall that they were supremely confident going into the game, because you remember Kentucky was 31-3.
Mm-hmm.
They had already beaten Derek McKee, Buck Johnson, and Alabama 4 times.
Yeah,
because they had eliminated them earlier in the tournament, but beat them twice in the 2 regular season meetings, as well as the
SEC tournament.
SEC tournament. They had beaten LSU 3 previous times, 2 regular season meetings, as well as the conference tournament. But they were supremely confident, referring to LSU, because it was nip and tuck all 3 times. The second game of which in the regular season at LSU, Roger Harden, boy, that's a name.
Oh, wow.
He hit a buzzer. You remember LSU was down 2. Derek Taylor pulled from like 18, bang, to tie the game with 5 seconds left. And Roger Harden ran the length of the court and pulled from the top of the key at the gun, bang, game over, they win. And then he sort of did the same thing, hit a late shot in that SEC tournament game that proved to be the difference. So LSU was supremely confident going into the game because they knew they could play with them, because they went nip and tuck with them 3 times. But this time, to your point, they kind of, it's crazy how saying you slowed Kenny Walker down. The brother was 8 or 11 for 20 points. So, but hey, man, you got to take what you could get. And they just managed to They just managed to like kind of squeak by with a well-balanced effort, and to your point, a defensive struggle, and they kind of made the game ugly, which was imperative for them to do in order to advance, which they managed to do.
Yeah, so they advanced to the Final Four. This time is in Dallas. Second Final Four under Dale Brown. First 11 seeds to reach the Final Four, and they beat the top 3 seeds in their region to get there. Something that no team has ever done since, to beat the top 3 seeds to get to the Final Four. But of course, continuing the theme, losing to the eventual national champion, this time losing to never nervous Purvis Ellison and Louisville, 88-77 in Dallas.
Boom. But Purvis Ellison, is he perhaps the worst number 1 overall pick of all times?
He might be. He's up there. He's up there with him and maybe Kwame Brown.
No, Anthony Bennett with the Cleveland
Michael
Cavaliers.
Olowokandi.
Yeah, but they just, you remember, I remember that Louisville team being extremely experienced.
I always thought the best player on that team was not Purvis Ellison, but Milt Wagner.
Milt Wagner was a baller. He had a 16 for 22 points. But you remember, he was a major league problem, but he had blown his knee out.
Yeah.
And then came back. He was still good, but he wasn't great after that. But you remember Billy Thompson, number 55. He played with the Lakers a little bit on the famous no-look magic do against Fat Lever the Nuggets. That Billy Thompson when he blapped on the Nuggets. But 10 or 11, 22 points. But it just seemed like Louisville shot 56% from the field for the game, compared to only 45% for LSU. And that was pretty much the difference of the game. They just couldn't complete defensive possessions and stop them. And so Louisville advances. And then, as we all know, they played Duke. That was the emergence of Duke that year too.
Right.
When first time they made the Final Four with Johnny Dawkins. And but they couldn't stop Purvis Ellison. He kind of took over the championship game.
Yeah, especially in the second half. He went nuts in the second half.
Yes.
Against Duke. And that was the Johnny Dawkins, Tommy Amaker,
Jay Billis, Mark Allery.
Yeah.
Mark Allery and those guys, they just couldn't handle Purvis inside, and he presided on the boards and presided on the scoreboard as well.
Exactly. Moving on, 86-87. And another great LSU team, 24-15, 8-10 in conference, losing record in conference. Okay, but still, you had the backbone still remain. Nikita Wilson returned. You had Bernard Woodside. You had the emergence of Jose Vargas, Darryl Joe, and of course, Ricky Blanton rounding out the group. Also on the team that I did not know. He didn't play much, but he became famous for LSU in another sport. We're talking about Ben McDonald. the pitcher that was the number one draft pick overall by the Orioles, I think in 1992.
Yes, sir.
He was on the team.
I remember he come
was
in
on
and
the
lay
team.
wood. I remember being McDonald, and he used to wear the Patrick Ewing T-shirt under the jersey,
Right.
and he just come in moving screens and laying. He just did something. That was it. I remember that.
And also they had and also the return of Anthony Wilson. So you had the backbone of that Final Four team, most of them returning. Okay. This year, once again, they're a 10th seed. They're not an 11th seed. They moved up a seed to being a 10th seed. Okay, in the Midwest. In the SEC tournament, they reached the championship game, lost to Alabama. Okay, but they reached the 10th seed in the tournament, and they get off to this great start. They beat Georgia Tech, rematch from the year before. They beat Georgia Tech again, 85-79. They beat the 25th seed. They beat number 2 seed Temple, 72-62. Now, who was on that team? Was that the
that was 86. That wasn't Mark Macon yet.
I didn't think so.
That wasn't Mark Macon yet. That was like Howell Evans.
Yeah.
Howell Evans and what's that boy name? It wasn't Dwayne Caldwell yet.
No.
He was definitely the most prominent player on that team was the point guard Howell Evans.
Yeah,
and,
okay.
They beat them, and then they also beat DePaul.
DePaul
year too. Yes, sir.
They beat DePaul 63-58 to reach the regional final again in Cincinnati against Indiana. Okay, now I went back and watched this game too. One of the things they kept mentioning was this: what it would be like if LSU won that game and played the Final Four. That year, the Final Four was in New Orleans. Could you imagine that? If LSU played the Final Four in 1987 and the Final Four that year was in New Orleans, what that scene would have been like?
It would have been wild, but question for you, because I distinctly remember in 87, I was in 6th grade. That was the year of the Keep Smart shot and the Derek Coleman missed free throw, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so in the national semifinal that year, Indiana played Talk the Shark, UNLV. Field is Freddie Banks, Jarvis, Bass Knight, and Mark Wade, and those guys.
Yeah.
Would LSU been able to run with those guys?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Neither do I.
I don't think so, because as good as LSU was, they wasn't as athletic as UNLV was. And that has been UNLV's calling card since Tark arrived in Vegas. Is their overall athleticism.
Because you remember Indiana had to beat them in an up and down game. They tried all they could to slow that game down. They couldn't. And they just said the hell with it. We got to beat them playing their game basketball. And they managed to do it. Fortunately, under the tutelage of one of the greatest coaches of all time, who could never coach today, through no fault of his own, but none other than the General Robert Montgomery Knight.
Yeah.
He would get fired in 2 weeks now. Because none of that would fly. Like with me, I don't mind a little fine brimstone coach. You grab me by the collar, fine. But if you say you're going to kick my well, let's go in the back room and see who come out. Let's see.
That's it. So Indiana, they play Indiana in Cincinnati for the regional final. Nikita Wilson, 20 points. And this was probably like the precursor of what you may see for LSU for the next few years. With 5 minutes remaining, LSU had control of the game and a 9-point lead.
I remember.
And they had literally had control of the game, but for situations beyond their control, 1981 was revisited where they went cold from the field in the late part of the game. They just got ice cold. Indiana took advantage. It came down to last second tip in by Rick Callaway to eliminate the Tigers with like 2 seconds left in the game, which wasn't enough for LSU to do anything. and Indiana ended up winning 77-76 and advancing to New Orleans. And it was one of the most disappointing losses in maybe in the history of the program because they had the game and they had pretty much their ticket punched for New Orleans, but their shooting just got ice cold all of a sudden.
Yes, and this was probably one of the most heartbreaking losses because this is the game. Two things happened. This is the game Bobby Knight got pissed off.
Yeah.
You remember he slammed the phone on the scores table.
Yeah.
He not only didn't he get ejected,
but that would have been a second
no
tech.
Technicals.
That would
wasn't even technical or anything.
Right.
You know.
That should have been his tech because he got awarded a technical foul like within the first, I think maybe 5-6 minutes of the game. He got a tech for running because he called a timeout and it ran out onto the court, like almost to the other side of the court for where the bench was to argue with the referee. Yeah. So they rang him up with a tech. Later on in the first half, he slams the phone. He's yelling at he got into it with the commissioner of the Big Ten too, right before halftime, and they never gave him a tech.
Dale Brown too. Dale Brown almost had to get active.
Yeah, there was a situation where Dale Brown was about to go toe to toe with him. So it was just it was like a lot of. It was very heated in the game, and it got heated on the court at times between the two teams. But go ahead.
I would say, but to even make it even worse, this is the game when after they barely escaped, he gets in the press conference after the game and say, with 5 to go, we were down 9. I'm like, man, we pretty much cooked. But then I looked up at the other bench and saw Dale Brown and say, God darn it, we got a shot. And son of a gun, if they didn't steal that game. And it's just like, it's like LSU just quit playing for some reason. And it's just like they tried to hold on and they literally pissed the game away. Literally.
It was one of those situations looking back at it. It's like the last 5 minutes of the game, it was almost as if LSU was trying not to lose instead of trying to win.
Correct.
They're just trying their best not to lose the game, And with Indiana and you got Robert Montgomery Knight on the other sideline, you need to win the game. It's like your NFL team and you look at the sidelines and you see Bill Belichick or Andy Reid. You got to win the game. You can't just sit down there and try to run out the clock. No, you can't do that with those guys. And especially with an Indiana who eventually would go on. No one knew it at the time, of course, but Indiana had more than a puncher's chance of winning the national championship in '87, which he eventually did.
Yes, and that was just a heartbreaking loss. And it's like, man, come on, you got Steve. Even though he was all American and Mr. Olympian and all that, you got Steve Alford out there. You got to attack him every chance you get. You have to make him guard. You know, but they, just kind of pissed it away. That moment became too big for them.
Okay, 1988. Go through this real quick. 1988, they go 16-13. 10-8 in the SEC. They were a 9th seed. Not much to speak of. Why? They lost in the opening round of the tournament to Georgetown. Okay. But they would get their revenge against Georgetown in a game that is legendary in Louisiana. 1989 is the second part of the great Dale Brown story. Okay. He brings in this kid from Gulfport, Mississippi.
Yes, Gulfport.
From Gulfport, Mississippi, named Chris Jackson. Now, let me tell you something about Chris Jackson, okay? And when I say this to younger people that have never seen Chris Jackson, of course, everybody knows him, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. When he was at LSU, he was literally a cross between Kyrie Irving and Steph Curry. That was him. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
He was a cross between Kyrie Irving and Steph Curry. That was Chris Jackson. Along with Chris Jackson, Vernell Singleton, and even though he was ineligible to play his first year, Stanley Roberts, who would become one half of what would later be known as the Twin Towers at LSU. The other half of the Twin Towers, we're going to mention a little bit later on.
Jackson in 1989, All-American. They have a rematch with Georgetown on January the 28th at the Superdome, which at the time set an all-time NCAA college basketball attendance record. They ended up beating Georgetown by 2, 82-80, in one of the best basketball games I ever seen. But they reached the tournament again as a 10 seed. Okay. And they end up losing to UTEP, led by the great Tim Hardaway and Coach Don Haskins, 85-75 in Tucson.
Yes, sir. What a year that was. And as I said earlier in the episode, in Louisiana, we're a football state.
Yeah.
We'll watch basketball. We care about winning.
Yeah.
But if you can, if you don't quite win it, but you can be entertaining as hell in the process, we'll come out and see it. And, LSU was always a fairly hot ticket at Baton Rouge at the time.
Right.
But when Chris Jackson stepped on campus, I still remember, because, this was back in the days, just for context, I don't know how old or young a lot of people are. This is for context, like how now when a high school guy comes, what he plays like, what he looks like. They have all kind of highlight clips on YouTube or social media. Back then, all you had to go on was Street and Smith's magazine. That was it.
And word of mouth.
And word of mouth. They would have these things like Chris Jackson averaged 35 in high school. You have no idea how he looks. You have no idea how he plays.
Exactly.
You don't lay eyes upon the man until he debuts in their first game on TV, which for me was against Florida at Florida in Gainesville, and he put up 50 on Norm Sloan and the Gators. And then during that year, he was just scoring 40. And then within that year, one of the best, probably the best college basketball duel I have ever seen in my life to this day. And that was in Oxford against Ole Miss, January 31st, 1990, overtime. Ole Miss 79, LSU 77. Why? Chris Jackson, he put up 55, and Ole Miss had a cat. Now, how is this for a nickname? You know this a baller. Gerald World Class Glass. Killing cats.
Yeah.
He had 53. Man, they were just going back and forth. And to tell you how much of a hooper they were, I know you remember this. We talked about Jefferson Pilot at the time. Sometimes, for whatever reason, Jefferson Pilot may not show the game. They may opt to show another game. So in those instances, a lot of times on the road, LSU, they would deploy out their own broadcasters to the game. I think it was the Channel 9 guys, Steve Schneider and someone else.
Yeah, I remember that, right.
You remember? They used to have Tiger Vision Select event.
Yeah.
You could pay $7 and get the game to come on. And my dad, Chris Jackson, had been hooping so much, my dad say, screw that. We ordering the game tonight. And that was the game he ordered on a Saturday night. He had to, on the Saturday, they say this was a Wednesday. I could have sworn that was on Saturday, but whatever. We ordered the game and we stayed up and watched that magnificent duel between the two of those guys. And like you said, he just had a magnificent freshman campaign, and then, ended with the duel between himself and the guy who we didn't know at the time would take the world by storm. But the guy, Mr. UTEP two-step himself, Tim Hardaway. We didn't know it at the time in college. We were like, man, that dude kind of nice. But then when he got to the Golden State Warriors, and then I got skills commercial for Nike, we were like, okay, that dude is a baller. Wonderful, wonderful duel where Chris Jackson came up short and the Tigers in the tournament going home in the first round.
Now, let me ask you something about that Tiger Vision, because I remember that, and we never got Tiger Vision, but was those games on tape delay, or was that live?
No, it was live.
Okay.
They call it select event. So sometimes, because, like a lot of times, like some of the LSU football road games would be on, like if it wasn't on ESPN or anything like that. But a lot of so it's like an early type of on-demand pay-per-view type of thing. Basically, like the equivalent of a pay-per-view basketball game. That's exactly what it was. So they would, like, I guess the local media, because I know Steve Schneider from
Channel 9. Yeah.
Channel 9 WFB. He was the color man, and I forget who was the play-by-play. They would send them there. You order the game comes on TV live from whatever. And typically, for the most part, it would be road conference games.
Right.
You know,
because that game was in Oxford. That game was in Oxford, right?
And you know, he was just world class. Glass was just killing Ricky Blanton, man, just killing. You know, what I mean, just one of the best duels I've ever seen in college.
Now, with the emergence of Chris Jackson and the emergence of Vernell Singleton, LSU would go into 1990 as the number 2 ranked team in the country, despite the fact losing early in the tournament. Mostly because they had an addition to this Twin Towers thing that they have. And the other half of the Twin Towers joining Stanley Roberts was none other than Shaquille O'Neal. And they started the season at number 2. Jackson that year, 1990, well, LSU that year goes 23-9 in the regular season. Jackson is an All-American for the second year in a row. They beat the eventual champion UNLV. Then this is games during the regular season. They beat UNLV 107-105, who would eventually go on to win the national championship that year. They beat Texas 124-113. Now these sound like NBA scores, but this is college. And this game here, I was at this game. I went to this game because I was such of a fan of not LSU, but the team that they were playing. They beat Loyola Marymount 148-141. That was probably, I was winded after this game. It was so high scoring. You know, one of the things that I remember through this game was that Loyola Marymount was running LSU so much that at the TV timeout or something, Shaq was about to pass out. They ran Shaq so much. He was like waving the nail bro, take me out. But they put up 148 points on Loyola Marymount. Okay. And Loyola Marymount scored 141. Okay. That was the heyday of the, Paul Westhead, guru of Go, Loyola Marymount Lions team with Hank Gathers and Bo Kimball and Corey Gaines and that group. Per Steamer and that group. And they also beat Notre Dame. Once again, in the Superdome, again, they played Notre Dame 87-64. So they were winning games, but they were scoring a lot. But can it translate into the tournament? That was the big question, because now you have a group that had a legitimate shot of winning the national championship with this lineup: Chris Jackson, Stanley Roberts, Vernell Singleton, Shaquille O'Neal, Gert Hammock. You had ballers now.
The late Wayne Sims.
Money
from the top of the key. Money.
But it didn't. For some reason, it just didn't. They expected big things from LSU. Big things. However, they lose in the second round. They beat Villanova 70-63. They win that game, but they just didn't look right during that game. I remember watching that game, and Villanova didn't Villanova have Kerry Kittles at that time?
No, that's a little early.
Okay,
I think because Kerry Kittles, if I remember, he didn't appear until the mid '90s. That was probably
that's right, because my high school lost to Kerry Kittles in St. Aug in '90.
I know Raleigh Massimino was still the coach. I think they were just kind of coming back a little bit, because you remember right after they beat Georgetown in '85, they had the whole Gary McLean thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Sting and all that. Then they were like on
probation
things and all of that.
Yeah.
And I think they were just kind of coming back a little bit,
right.
and all of that in that game. But before you get to the Georgia Tech game, it was just a great season. Because speaking like those two games, to my point, you were like they couldn't get it together. It was kind of what I alluded to earlier, where I think they had such an embarrassment of riches that Dale Brown wasn't accustomed to that. So
that's what I'm about to ask.
He wasn't accustomed.
Yeah.
And then, go ahead.
No, I was about that. I was just going to say that it was one of those situations where it was like totally opposite from what he was used to in the 80s, in that you had basically taken parts that didn't really fit or mesh together, that wasn't really all that talented, and getting the most out of them. The question now was, now that you got athletic and pure talent, can you lead them? Can you lead them over the top? And that was becoming like one of Dale Brown's things that he had to answer to, was the fact that he could take lesser talented teams and get the most out of them, but he couldn't take the overly talented teams to get them to where they needed to go.
Correct.
And that was like the great paradox of his career.
Correct. But I think it would have helped a whole lot if that previous season, because you remember the previous season, Chris came in as a true freshman, but so did Stanley Roberts, but he was ineligible due to the aforementioned Proposition 48 rule. I think it would have, had Stanley Roberts played that year, it would have helped a lot, because it would have given he and Chris a chance to work together and get his feet under him. Then now you add Shaq, you already have an established center, and you can kind of set your rotation from there. But with the Proposition 48 happening and Stanley coming back, coinciding with the arrival of Shaquille O'Neal, you remember they used to have the starting lineup. They started them both at the same time, along with Chris Jackson, where it's like, okay, it's not enough room for with both of them out there to operate. You remember you had like Still Singleton, you had Harold Boudreaux, you had cats like Wayne Sims. I thought that it would have been better. He probably, more clearly defining the roles. Now, would you had gotten Chris Jackson to take a back seat at that point? Probably not.
No.
You know what I mean? But you could have staggered the minutes in a way. Don't play Shaq and Roberts together. Stagger the minutes.
Right. Play them both, in certain situations, game situations, but don't start them at the same time, because it kind of stagnates the offense, and you basically cut down the area in which to run your offense. To compensate for that, you're going to have to start running your offense near the midcourt line with those two guys in there at the same time.
Or even use another ball handler to move Chris over to the 2.
Yeah.
Someone that can facilitate and kind of get everyone involved and kind of split the touches or whatever. Yeah. Well, is Chris still going to get the lion's share? But anyway, 2 of the greatest games I ever seen was that Nevada-Las Vegas game, where, them against Larry Johnson, Greg Anthony, Anderson Hunt, Stacey Augmon. Then the very next week, the game you allude to, I sat there and watched the late, great Hank Gathers put up 48, while, albeit a young Shaq and a young Stanley Roberts, manhandled both of them.
Yeah.
And en route to 48 points. And, I mean, this was when college basketball was box office, man.
Yeah.
But anyway, they limped to the tournament, as you mentioned, and then met an unceremonious end. Details, please.
They lose to Georgia Tech 94-91. And this Georgia Tech team, once again, another great Bobby Cremins team, Kenny Anderson, Dennis Scott, Malcolm Mackey, and Brian Oliver. I mean, again, and they would end up 1990 going to the Final Four.
Lethal Weapon 3.
Yep, they end up going to the Final Four, ended up losing to Duke, if I'm not mistaken, in the national semifinal.
No, they lost to UNLV in the national. Because that was the year they were up on UNLV at 7 at half, and then UNLV came out in the second half and just ran roughshod over them. And then that's the year when UNLV played Duke and beat them by 30.
Yep.
In the championship game. But then that's the year, because you remember Duke had been the several Final Fours, hadn't even broken through yet. Then that's the following year when UNLV were undefeated, and they met Duke in the national semifinal. But this time Duke had Grant Hill, and they finally beat them, and then beat Greg Ostertag, Adonis Jordan, Rex Walters, and Kansas to win their first title, first of many titles.
Yeah. 1991, LSU goes 20-10. Okay. 13-5 in the SEC, but Shaquille O'Neal, 27.6 points per game, National Player of the Year, first team All-American. Okay, Vernell Singleton, 15.2 points per game, also adding to the attack, Gert Hammock, Mike Hansen, and of course, Harold Boudreaux, who pulled off the greatest in-game dunk I ever saw that year. I attended when LSU played Allen Houston and Tennessee at the Assembly Center in, I think, February of 1991. I don't exactly remember the date. But Harold Boudreaux gets a pass off of a rebound by Gert Hammock. Gert Hammock throws a long outlet pass to Harold Boudreaux. He takes one step. Allen Houston's waiting for him under the basket. He jumps, does an in-game 360 on Allen Houston, and dunks it.
Bam.
I lost my mind. I was like, that is still the greatest in-game dunk I ever saw live, in person, in my life. Still to this day.
Because I was about to challenge you with the Jerome Lane dunk, man.
But I saw
Jerome dunk, man. You know.
But that's the greatest dunk I ever saw live in person, in real time. You know, because I was sitting right there on the baseline as he was coming at me. You know, and me, my dad, and a couple of my friends went to that game, and that was just so awesome to see that.
Now, right quick before I just interject. Now, this ties back to what we did last episode, right? Now, while all of this, like we talked a lot about last week, Avery Johnson and Southern on the north side of town with the bluff. At the same time all that was going on, this is what was going on at LSU on the south side of town, all at the same time.
Exactly right. Exactly right. LSU, I mean, Baton Rouge for a very short time period. You know, just like in the early 2000s when you had LSU and Southern winning national championships, LSU winning the national championship and Southern winning the Black College national championship. This was sort of similar in 1991 when LSU was really good in basketball and so was Southern.
Correct.
You know, and this was like a hotbed of college basketball for a very short time in the Red Stick. You know, Southern was good, LSU was good. This was some high times of basketball, not only but in the state, because you also had UL Lafayette was really good at that time too. You know, even Nicholls State was making some noise. You know, so it was like a really, really good time for hoops in the Pelican State at the time.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It was
1991, though. Another early exit, this time by UConn. 79-62. They get blown out. But I think Shaq got injured heading into this tournament, if I'm not mistaken. He didn't play much. He was injured either in the SEC tournament or or doing the game against Connecticut, and they just couldn't recover.
Wasn't that the year when Carlos Groves cheap shot at Shaq in the SEC tournament? And Dale Brown
That's right, yeah.
And he stole on he stole on him in the middle of the game. He didn't well, I'm sorry, folks. Steal means a sucker punch, basically.
Right.
Well, not a sucker punch in the traditional term. Dale Brown punched and Quentin Groves was a sucker. So in that, because Shaq went up for a dunk and he just grabbed him by the waist from behind. Yanked him. And you remember that resulted in Dale Brown. They were cheap shotting Shaq so many times. He advised Shaq to go pro before he got hurt because people was kind of maliciously trying to cheap shot him constantly.
Right, which he did the following year, but in 1992. But again, the similar situation in 92, losing a second round, this time to Indiana. You know, and a very interesting stat about Shaq's tenure at LSU during that time, the Tigers had won 72% of their games when Shaq was there. And they finished second in the SEC. They won one SEC title with Shaq and finished second twice with Shaq on the team. So this was, again, another sustained era of success for LSU. Unfortunately, not only no national championship, but no Final Four appearances. So now there's some rumblings going on in LSU and Louisiana. Like, okay, you've had all of these chances. You haven't been to the Final Four in 5 years now, 6 years now, with better teams, but you just haven't been there. You're like, okay, what's going on? Okay. So, and there was a lot of rumblings going on along the bayou about LSU Tiger basketball.
Now, in his defense, Dale Brown's defense, that is, whereas before we were talking about from the outset of the Southeastern Conference that they were more of a, kind of a sideshow type of deal. They were legit by now because you remember by the early 90s, you had LSU. You remember Alabama had Hollywood, James Robinson, Robert Ory, and Latrell Sprewell. You remember the battles they and LSU had. LSU used to battle Arkansas. Arkansas was now in the Southeastern Conference, but this is when they had the Mayday connection, Lee Mayberry, Todd Day, Scotty Thurman, Oliver Miller, Nolan Richardson as the coach. You remember Alex Dillard? He used to pull from half court, and all of that. And then this is Rick Pitino had kind of turned the tide at Kentucky. This is when they had
the unforgettables, when they had Jamal Mashburn, Richie Farmer, that group, Sean Woods, Mike Pelfrey, that group. So the SEC was no longer like no longer Kentucky, everybody else. It had some real, during the time period, not only LSU came up, but a lot of the schools in the SEC had came up. Correct. Auburn had gotten better. Mississippi State, Florida was still getting there. Was getting better. So while all of this was going on, the SEC was starting to catch up, and LSU was not able to get the recruits or Dale Brown, I should say, was not getting the recruits that he would normally was getting during that time period. 1993. 22-11, 9-7 in the SEC. One of the things that you notice about the SEC records is it's starting to be a little bit more 500-ish. It's 500. And it's not because of lack of coaching and lack of talent. It's maybe the addition of talent in other schools that was starting to catch up to LSU.
Also misfortune.
Yes.
You remember starting like 93, 94, around there, that's what they have. Now, these the guys we used to play against sometimes at the old Armory. You remember we'd play like Clarence Caesar, Sean Gibson, Andre Owens. They all used to be in the Armory all the time talking. Brandon Titus, they all used to be in there talking stuff. And you know how I am. We won SEC. We won SEC. Hell, I wasn't out there when you did it, bro. Ball up top. Let's get it.
Right. Exactly.
But he had some misfortune at the time because you remember his golden goose, his Penny Hardaway, his Jason Kidd, that was really supposed to turn everything around.
Randy Livingston.
There you go. Blew his knee out. And by all accounts, he was a can't miss perennial all-star, Hall of Fame NBA talent rather. And he blew his knee out and he had committed to LSU, and including Ronnie Henderson as well. And I think when Randy Livingston blew his knee out, that just did it once that happened.
A lot of people wanted to compare. Now, what was I can never think of this kid's name. The kid that went to LSU recently, that was a point guard from Australia. What was his name?
Ben Simmons.
Ben Simmons.
Nothing, man.
A lot of people, and I call this hoop blasphemy, that wanted to compare Ben Simmons to Randy Livingston.
Not even close.
It's not even close.
I saw Randy Livingston in high school. Now Randy Livingston, I swear, Randy Livingston was about the size of like about 6'4". It's like around the size of Russell Westbrook.
Yeah.
Derrick Rose at his apex, with every bit of the athleticism both of them had, perhaps even more. But he had a consistent jump shot, and even though he was tremendously athletic, could get his own shot at any time, he was probably Jason Kidd-esque in terms of elevating his teammates, because despite all of his immense talent, he was a pass first point guard.
Right.
He could make all of his players better. So the thing was, with Ronnie Henderson and some of the talent, had he came in, he'd have been able to elevate them, and they would have, LSU would have been back on the map in terms of prominence, but then he blew his knee out and he came back, but he was still very good, but he was no longer special.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I remember watching Randy Livingston and hear about how good Randy Livingston was, when and he was just such of an incredible player. I'm sitting here looking him up. Let's see.
He still managed a few years in the league. He played at
Newman
High School, Newman, same high school as the Manning brothers. He went to school there. Yep.
Yeah. The Manning brothers, Odell Beckham, Isidore Newman High School, the feeder school for Tulane. But I mean, I had heard stories about him because my high school, New Iberia High, was like one of the top high schools in the state. Was a basketball factory. And we used to run into Isidore Newman and Jesuit and St. Aug in the state playoffs every year and get blasted. I mean, one year we played my junior year, we played St. Aug in the state finals. Okay, and Kerry Kittles was on the team, and Kerry Kittles came off the bench. To show you how good that team was.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And they beat us by 40 in the state championship game.
Dude, I've seen clips of this guy, and I think I saw him because they played, who was it? I think they played Catholic one year.
Baton Rouge?
Baton Rouge. Yeah, Catholic and Baton Rouge one year. And I saw a lot of times you see guys like, you remember like certain players, you be like, his reputation precedes him. Then when you see the guy, you're like, okay, he pretty good, but I don't see that. This dude, Randy Livingston, man, the hype didn't do justice in terms of how cold that dude was.
Right.
That dude was cold, man.
The only other situation that I can remember where the hype was not enough hype was when I was a sports writer in Morgan City, and the Morgan City girls team went to the state championship game and played Capital in 2001, 2002.
Okay.
And Capital had this chick named Simone Augustus. I had never seen a girl ball like that ever in life. Oh my God. There were certain times in that game I thought she was going to dunk. I really did. I thought she was going to dunk. Oh my gosh. Who later went on to LSU. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, 93, they go 22-11, 9-7 in the SEC, led by Gert Hammock, Jamie Brandon. Hammock, 15.3 points per game. Jamie Brandon, 11.8 points per game. And Maurice Williamson, the son of Super John Williamson, former star for the New Jersey Nets, 10.4 points per game. But they lose to Cal in the first round on the last second shot, led by Jason Kidd. Okay, so here's the situation. Now, 5 straight 20-win seasons, 5 straight 20-win seasons, but never rated back to the Sweet 16. Okay, so we just talked about the Randy Livingston in 94. They brought in Randy Livingston and Ronnie Henderson in 94. But from that point on, they just couldn't get back to the tournament. Okay, Randy Livingston had a myriad of injuries, mostly his knee. Okay, and the downfall really came 96, 97. And the whole Lester Earl incident. And those of you who don't remember, Lester Earl was this high recruit that came to LSU and basically was paid off by a booster, okay, to play for LSU. And now, for the presence of time, I've remembered this because we was at Southern at this time. And you heard about Lester Earl all the time. In fact, he played a couple. I remember playing against him on campus.
I was literally about to say, you were in the back in the girls' gym on campus.
Yeah.
But also, we played against him a couple times because you probably don't remember. I used to take you everywhere. It was a whirlwind. Right. But you remember we used to play at Bernard Terrace Elementary?
Yeah.
It's like downtown off of Government, not too far from Baton Rouge High. We all used to play there. He used to, he and his brother Lewis and they homie Corey Powell They
Right.
all went to Glen Oaks together because one of my cousins played with them too at the time and all that. So they used to be over there sometimes. So we crossed paths with them a few times.
Right. He was suspended for 11 games by LSU for accepting money supposedly from an assistant coach when it wasn't true. It actually came from a booster. But Lester Earl ratted them out, okay, mostly being pressured by the NCAA to say that, in which he was really lying, okay? So he eventually transferred to Kansas. And that right there pretty much spelled the end of the Dale Brown era, an unceremonious end to the Dale Brown era at LSU.
Yeah, and you know how I feel about that kind of stuff, man. Like, like a lot of these times, like I remember a guy, around the same time, I don't know if you remember, guy that was my cousin's running mate. What's that boy name? Something Cole. He played, he the one that got Jim Herrick done in at Georgia because he took all the benefits and then after it's over with and he didn't go to the league. Well, we didn't even have to go to class. They go, you enjoy the benefit, but then once it doesn't materialize for you like you feel it should have, then you snitch.
Then you rat everybody out.
You rat everybody out when you partook.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, like, and it was kind of similar here. Like, man, if you're gonna partake, I'm not here to say what right or wrong is, but I'm just saying, but if I partook, I'm not gonna get on my moral high horse after the fact and then be like, well, what? No, you take your lick like everyone else, man.
Right.
So and that, like you said, he kind of snitched, and and then you mentioned that Dale Brown wasn't as successful anyway. So a lot of times you have these sorts of things when you're winning, going deep in the tournaments, making Final Fours. You're like, okay, these are transgressions that can be overlooked. But then when you're not as successful on the court, it's like, well, no, we can't overlook this.
Right. So in closing of this part of the episode, if you had to succinct everything that Dale Brown means to the athletic program at LSU, how would you put that into words? How would you put the Dale Brown era at LSU into words if you could?
Legendary, routine, unprecedented heights. Because you got to think when you look back at it in retrospect, because we were experiencing it in real time, we were just kids. But when you look back at it in a retrospect, LSU were, the Dukes, the North Carolinas, the Georgetowns, the Syracuses. LSU was in that realm as far as like from a profile standpoint, and unprecedented success and all of that. And I say routine because he did it year after year for a time period. And those have been heights that since he's been gone, they've only reached those heights once or twice.
They've only been to the Final Four once since, and that was in 2006. In typical Dale Brown type of fashion, a team that had no business being in the Final Four making it.
Correct.
This is the Big Baby Davis era at LSU.
Correct. There you have it. So, and I say routine because they routinely were in the mix. And since his departure, is much lower profile, not only due to their lack of success on the court, but that is also correlated with, for the most part, the final full realization of unrealized potential of LSU football. Because Louisiana for many decades was a hotbed of football talent, just waiting to be kind of cultivated. And starting with Nick Saban, they've kind of been on that upward trajectory for the most part, with some inconsistencies ever since. So I think between the ascension of the football and just the lack of basketball success, what was once, you remember you talked to LSU in the 80s, basketball was more noted than football. Now, LSU basketball, men's basketball, that is, primarily resides in the shadows these days.
Right. I mean, like, for example, like what you just said about the LSU football program that had pretty much taken off when Nick Saban came in. It has been pretty much been a success ever since with a number of different coaches.
Correct.
Everybody from Mike Kelly to Ogeron to, whoever, they've always had success in football because football has always been the driving force for LSU for years. Okay. To top all of that off, LSU kind of succeeded, LSU's football program succeeded them as well as the baseball program. Okay.
Exactly.
Because prior to 1991, LSU was always on this upswing of talent. As far as like getting to the College World Series, starting with the '91 team that won the national championship, with the guys like Ben McDonald and Warren Morris and Jared Mitchell.
Lyle Bouton, who was also on the basketball team.
Right, exactly. And, they had overshadowed LSU as far as historically being the bell cow of the LSU athletic program. But I wanted to at least give them their kudos and their flowers during the time period when you said it yourself, when we were our most impressionable, with them having the success that they had in the 80s and the early 90s with some of the greatest games that we've ever seen and that made us basketball fans. And a lot of that came watching Dale Brown and LSU at the Assembly Center on WAFB and Jefferson Pilot Sports, which was always cool, and eating golden flake potato chips.
Yes, sir. You remember old Tiger chips with you remember old Jose Vargas from the Dominican Republic, Jose Vargas, Tiger chips. It was just like a lot of characters, a lot of larger than life characters, and just a lot of larger than life games, player arcs, coach arcs, team arcs, program arcs.
Yes.
And it was just larger than life at that time, man.
So with that, we're going to take a little short break, and coming back, we're going to send a shout out, unfortunately, a melancholy shout out to one of the greatest basketball players to ever play in the state of Louisiana that a lot of people don't really know about. But his game was out of this world at a time where it needed to be, and he put a little small school in Louisiana on the map in the early 1970s. We'll talk about him in a moment. You're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast here on the Sports History Network. And we're back here on the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast to wrap up this episode. Thanks once again for Chuck joining us here on this Sunday night. And thank you once again for joining us wherever you're getting this podcast. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be checking us out. We're going to send a melancholy shout out to a Louisiana basketball legend who just recently passed away. A man by the name of Dwight Bo Lamar from Columbus, Ohio. Born April 7th, 1951, he was a two-time consensus All-American at the time, a school known as University of Southwest Louisiana, which of course you know now as Louisiana Lafayette. Led the nation in scoring in 1971 and the 1972 season. Freshman of the Year in the Gulf States Conference, which was the precursor of the Sun Belt, averaging 22.8 points per game as a freshman. First team All-American selection in 1973. Now, he was All-American selection with these guys: Bill Walton, David Thompson, and Ernie DeGregorio. Those were ballers supreme of the early 1970s. Averaged 31.2 points per game, scored 3,493 points, known for his long-range shooting, finished his career as still the third highest scoring player in the history of college basketball. Jerry Tarkanian, the famous head coach of the UNLV Running Rebels, once said of him, "Bo Lamar is the purest shooter I've ever seen." During his time at ULL or USL at the time, they had a record of 90-23 in 4 seasons. His last 3 seasons, the Cajuns went 74-13. Only UCLA had a better record during that period. He was the 3rd pick overall by the Detroit Pistons in the 1973 draft, but he was the number 1 overall pick by the ABA San Diego Conquistadors, which is one of the coolest team names I've ever heard. And that year, he was named the ABA All-Rookie Team. And when I think of Bo Lamar, and saw some clips of him playing, this guy was so electric and such of a great shooter, and for him at the time be the 3rd all-time leading scorer in the history of college basketball. And for a time, he was number 2 behind LSU's Pete Maravich, which is insane. And they played, they missed each other by a couple of years in Louisiana, but at one time you had Pete Maravich, and then right after that you had Bo Lamar, who was one of the great pure scorers in the history of college basketball. He is what I would call a professional scorer.
Hooper. And his college coach said if it was a 3-point shot them days, he'd have been good for 50. And then, and you know me, I love a guy that I love 2 things about a baller. I like a guy. He say what the guy say he known for his long range shot. That some coaches said dusted the rafters. I love somebody that can shoot it out the screen when they on TV. Then secondly, I saw a lot of his ABA highlights recently. He was a good jelly man too. I love a good jelly man.
And those of you who don't know, it's basically a finger roll.
Yeah, a jelly man. So
those of you who don't jelly. Those of you who don't know the street ball jargon, a jelly man is somebody who could just lay it up with a finger roll and have the pretty finger roll like a George Gervin. And boy, was he like that as well. And just a pure shooter. My dad knew him, because my dad went to UL about the same time he did. And he was just such a great player. I still would consider him the greatest player in the history of UL by far. Even though UL had some success in the tournament in the late 80s, early 90s, they had some success in the tournament. In fact, one year I think they beat Oklahoma in one round game, and recently they had made the tournament in a couple of years. But the player that really put the UL Raging Cajuns on the map, USL at the time, who put USL on the map, now Louisiana Lafayette, was the great Bo Lamar. We wanted to give him a shout out. The recently departed, Bo Lamar, may rest in power, and just an outstanding player.
Great shout out, man, and just legendary player, legendary baller who left his mark on the world and will be sorely missed.
Absolutely. And that will do it for this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. And we'll be right back after this break to wrap things up here on the Sports History Network.
Thank you once again for joining us here at the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. This podcast comes to you, as always, from the sports wing of TM4 Enterprises, which house the Bill King Memorial Studio, which we are located in suburban Atlanta in the shadow of Stone Mountain. Once again, don't forget to like and subscribe to the show so you can get brand new episodes whenever they are released. And as always, please tell people about us. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, tell your neighbors. Hell, tell a passerby in the street if you have to, if you think that they like sports history. And until next time, please be safe, and we'll see you again next time.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and we're able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.